Welcome to a course on Skywarn Communications in which we will all learn together on becoming a trained Skywarn communicator. Now, this presentation presupposes that you already have a basic understanding of Skywarn, but nevertheless, I will give a very brief summary of what the Skywarn program is and what its purpose serves. But also, it presupposes that you have taken Skywarn spotter training at any point in the past prior to watching this presentation. If you haven't done so, I would strongly encourage you to go to weather.gov and locate your nearest National Weather Service office and see what Skywarn training programs they have available. Many National Weather Service offices will give not only on site trainings at schools and other public venues, but also they will give virtual trainings in many instances as well. So we are going to specifically focus on not so much what we report as Skywarn spotters, but how we report it. But before we dive into the specifics of that, first a very brief introduction about myself. My name is Colin McConkey, amateur radio call sign KE8RXN, GMRS call sign WRPN553. I am a resident of Kent County, Michigan. For those unfamiliar, Kent County is the fourth largest county in the state of Michigan in terms of population, and also is home to the city of Grand Rapids, the second largest city in the state of Michigan. Kent County is located in western Lower Michigan, which is about a county in from the Lake Michigan shoreline. And so much of our weather all year round is very heavily influenced by what Lake Michigan does. In some cases, it amplifies severe weather. In other cases, it mutes the severe weather response. My current role for our Kent County Skywarn team is that I serve as one of the team leaders. I assist our uh, team leader with making decisions and writing policies and so on and so forth. So the purpose of this presentation again is to train us all in how to become a good Skywarn communicator, whether you are a member of Kent County Skywarn or another Skywarn team in some other part of the country or even in some other country itself. I hope this presentation is helpful to all of us. Very quickly, what is Skywarn? The official definition of Skywarn from weather.gov/Skywarn, according to the National Weather Service, is, quote, Skywarn is a volunteer program with between 350,000 and 400,000 trained severe weather spotters. These volunteers help keep their local communities safe by providing timely and accurate reports of severe weather to the National Weather Service. End quote. Now, in many instances over the last 3 decades in particular, the National Weather Service has agreements formerly known as MOUs, simply Memorandums of Understanding, with organizations such as the American Radio Relay League, otherwise known as the ARRL, REACT, which is a communications team that utilizes many different radio services, not just amateur radio, and other organizations as well to formally organize Skywarn teams to coordinate operations with a local National Weather Service office, typically under the authority of a local agency such as a county office of emergency management, using a variety of communication services. The most popular of which in 2024 is amateur radio, but many others can and should be utilized as well. To expand on the definition given by the National Weather Service at their weather.gov webpage, Skywarn spotters will report ground truth data to their local NWS office. Here in Kent County, Michigan, our local NWS office is located right within our city of Grand Rapids. Very convenient to have such close proximity to radar and to the National Weather Service office here, which in this ground truth data aids the National Weather Service in obtaining critical information to issue more timely and accurate warnings. That is our sole purpose as Skywarn spotters, but it certainly is a noble purpose in that we report severe weather data to our local National Weather Service meteorologists in order that they can better inform and warn the community residents that we live and work with, and to issue warning products and work with local emergency management agencies and first responders. Now, I should clarify that anyone can be a Skywarn spotter. All that is required to be a Skywarn spotter, according to the National Weather Service, is to take Skywarn spotter training. However, Being a Skywarn spotter doesn't necessarily mean that you are therefore part of an organized Skywarn team that often report to local agencies such as county emergency managers and so on and so forth. But don't let the fact that you are not part of a Skywarn team, if such is the case, discourage you. Whether you are part of an organized team or not, if you have taken Skywarn training, you are indeed a trained Skywarn spotter, and you can learn to communicate reports to the National Weather Service directly, or if you join an organized Skywarn team, to your team members and team leaders more effectively over the course of time. Now, when we talk about the topic of organized Skywarn teams, many Skywarn teams around the country utilize amateur radio, otherwise commonly known as ham radio. Amateur radio and ham radio are one and the same thing. Amateur radio is the actual official term, ham radio is simply the common term for it. GMRS radio, the General Mobile Radio Service, is becoming rapidly popular for Skywarn around the country, especially within the last 5 or 10 years. Definitely a good radio service with lower barrier to entry than amateur radio. There are some considerations when using GMRS that you don't need to take into account when using ham radio, and I may talk about that further on down the line in this presentation. Or you might use something completely different. You might use social media, you might use internet, you might use something such as a Discord server or TeamSpeak or Zello on a smartphone or other smartphone app or simply a text message group in order to communicate. However, you communicate information, either as a spotter that is solo and reporting directly to the National Weather Service, or more ideally, part of an organized Skywarn team. We all need to know not only what to observe in terms of our ground truth data, but also how to communicate our observations accurately and effectively. And that is the purpose of this presentation. We're going to cover specific ways to effectively communicate ground truth data, not only to the National Weather Service, but also specifically to our organized Skywarn teams. Before we look at how to communicate effectively, a summary once again of what do we report. And again, if you have not yet taken Skywarn Spotter training, I would certainly encourage you to do so because you will learn all of this information in greater detail. But what do we observe? We need to answer that question before we then ask, how do we report our observations? So what do we report? Generally speaking, Skywarn teams are most heavily centered upon severe thunderstorm reporting, according to the National Weather Service, and that indeed is accurate in reality. Here in Kent County, for example, we generally will activate far more often for severe thunderstorm warnings than we do any other kind of warning, but we do have criteria and standard operating procedures for other types of warnings as well, such as tornadoes or blizzards or ice storms and so forth. But to take the idea that primarily we report severe thunderstorm ground truth data, what exactly are we looking for when we observe severe weather conditions? We're looking for severe wind gusts, estimated or measured. We're looking for hail of any size, also estimated or measured. We're looking for cloud formations indicative of severe weather, such as wall clouds, funnel clouds, or tornadoes. We're looking for impacts from flooding, especially flash flooding. And we're also very importantly looking for storm damage. Damage not only to property, such as trees blown over, but also structures or infrastructure. For example, downed power lines or damage to homes or other structures or businesses. But as previously stated, severe summer weather is not the only thing that Skywarn teams can report. For example, in Kent County, being influenced at times by very heavy lake effect snow bands, we will often, or rather, we will also report severe winter weather impacts to our local National Weather Service office. For example, we have operating procedures for activating our team when there are ice storms, blizzard conditions, or other winter storm conditions. So, the fundamental question is, once we understand and have been trained in what to observe, how do we report that information? And that is what we are going to look at for the bulk of this presentation. First and foremost, before we even think about radio services or smartphone apps or social media or phones or anything of that nature, before we get to the tools, let's talk about the guiding principles that direct all of our communications, regardless of what communication tool we happen to use. The National Weather Service requires that Skywarn reports provide three absolutely critical pieces of information: time, event, and location. The National Weather Service needs to know when a severe thunderstorm ground truth piece of data was observed, or any severe weather data was observed. They need to know that, for example, because if they need to issue a warning immediately, that's going to have a much greater level of urgency than if they hear about a report for a weather system that moved out of their area that occurred 8 hours previously. They also need to know specifically what the event was. Was it a tornado that touched down to the ground? Was it a wall cloud that never materialized into a funnel cloud or tornado? Was it a 70-mile-per-hour straight line wind gust that knocked over trees and power lines and did extensive damage to siding and roofs of residential structures? What exactly was the severe weather event that needs to be reported to them? And finally, the location. They need to know where it is. National Weather Service offices often have an extensive coverage area known as a county warning area, commonly abbreviated in the weather world as CWA. They need to know where in their CWA a specific piece of ground truth data occurred. In other words, where is this report coming from? When is this report being generated regarding what event specifically, but also where specifically did it take place? My recommendation is when you give your location, make sure that you give your nearest cross streets and also the population center. For example, if I happen to say I am on Michigan Avenue, well, what city am I talking about? Or even what state? There's a Michigan Avenue in Chicago. There's a Michigan Avenue here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. There's a Michigan Avenue in many cities throughout the United States. I need to be much more specific than that. But if I say, for example, I'm located at the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Monroe here in downtown Grand Rapids, which I'm not currently at time of recording, but simply as an example, the National Weather Service can know exactly where I am. And if I report that there is a severe thunderstorm that is producing a funnel cloud, they may then decide to appropriately issue a tornado warning for the downtown Grand Rapids area in Kent County. If you happen to be mobile, in other words, you are driving while issuing a report to the National Weather Service or to an amateur radio net or GMRS net or over a smartphone app or whatever it might be, my recommendation there is give the nearest mile marker of the road that you are on if you are on a major roadway. Also give your direction of travel. For example, if you say that you're at mile marker 83 on northbound US 131, the National Weather Service will have a better understanding of where that is than if you simply say, I am traveling northbound on US 131. Also, make sure that you give your nearest population center if you happen to know it. If you don't happen to know it, just give as much information as you can. If you're not driving on a highway or a county road or something like that, again, try and identify the nearest intersection, the nearest cross streets, and give that information as well as the population center. When giving time, event, location data, we want to make sure that we follow the four pillars that I came up with. You could certainly create another list as well. I just summarized it into four P's or four pillars of Skywarn reporting: professionalism, politeness, preparedness, and purpose. We want to make sure that whatever tool we are utilizing, that we follow these principles, these four principles. Firstly, when I talk about professionalism, what do I not mean by that? What I don't mean by that is that we go around and try and imitate law enforcement officers or fire or EMS or other public safety officials and at best get in their way, or at the very worst, not only get in their way, but deceive our communities into thinking that we are people that we are not. That's not what I mean by professionalism. I don't mean imitating other professionals. What I mean by professionals is that we should all achieve the best standard of excellence that we are personally capable of. We should think of ourselves as amateurs only in the sense that we are not paid. And that's a work in progress for everyone, of course. Secondly, second principle is politeness. And by that I mean always be civil to those that are on your organized Skywarn team, to those that are leading your team, and especially make sure that you are polite to your served agencies and also to your local National Weather Service office. If there is ever a scenario due to stress or due to organizational politics or whatever the case may be, where there is tension present during a Skywarn event, take that conversation off the air or off the text message group. Try and follow it up with a cell phone call or something to that effect to try and bring the temperature of that situation down. Never let a situation distract you from the guiding principle of politeness when it comes to communication. Thirdly, we've talked about professionalism and politeness. Thirdly, preparedness. What I mean by preparedness is to make sure that you know that your equipment works or that if your equipment should fail, you have backup plans in place. But even more than that, when you are ready to communicate, especially, for example, if you're using a radio with a push to talk button, which enables you to transmit your voice over the air, make sure that you know what you are going to say and how you are going to say it. For example, on a radio, a push to talk button is just that. It's a push to talk. It's not a push to think. Make sure that you are prepared to be professional and polite. And finally, to have purpose behind what you are saying, to remember your purpose. We are trained Skywarn communicators, and for those of us that are on organized Skywarn teams, which I encourage all Skywarn spotters to be on, we are trained Skywarn communicators that serve our local agencies, our local NWS office, and the members of our local community. To briefly recap, make sure every report, to the best of your ability, is given in time, event, and location format. The precise order of that doesn't necessarily matter, but make sure that each of those three data points is absolutely present. When doing so, when communicating that, regardless of what tool you use, whether it's social media, amateur radio, GMRS, citizens band radio, whatever it might be professional, be polite, be prepared, and remember your purpose. So, with that in mind, we can now start the conversation on effective use and potential use of various tools. Generally speaking, regardless of what tool you have, the best way to get in contact with your local meteorologist at your local weather service office is going to be by phone. Many times, National Weather Service offices will give a direct number that spotters can utilize in order to report the specific criteria that that weather service office needs to know about. And while there are constants that are true throughout the country, nevertheless, your local geography is going to be influence or is going to influence rather the type of data that your National Weather Service office generally will need. For example, if I live in Montana, I'm probably not going to be concerned about reporting hurricane data to my local National Weather Service agency than if I live in Miami, Florida. If I live in Colorado, in an area that is prone to blizzards, I'm probably not going to report, generally speaking, the same kind of information as a spotter to my local weather service office as I would be if I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where they measure sunshine in feet out there. So just make sure that you are trained and that you know what your local National Weather Service agency needs. Again, all reports, whether you do it via a radio service such as amateur radio, whether you do it via social media, whether you do it directly over the phone, they need to be given in time, event, and location format in a professional, in a polite, in a prepared, and in a purposeful manner. So, with all that having been said, let's learn by some bad examples. What are some examples of bad reports that we can try and avoid and that we can all work together to overcome? The first example of what I would consider a bad report would be, quote, "This evening, a train spotter reports strong wind gusts blew down trees on a road near B Street." What is the issue with this particular report? Well, we have incomplete location data. The spotter says on a road near B Street. We don't happen to know which B Street he or she is referring to, if there happen to be multiple in the National Weather Service coverage area. We also don't know how strong these wind gusts were, and we don't know what kind of trees these were. Were they healthy, mature trees, say 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 feet in diameter if they're exceptionally large? Or were they small saplings that were recently planted? Or were these trees that have been dead and rotted for a decade at this point and easily fell over in a subsevere wind gust? So this report, again, does not give the time, it does not give much of the event information, and it gives incomplete location data. As another example, and these bad reports are all going to be variations on the same event until we conclude with a good example of, again, from this same event. Another bad report would be, quote, a few minutes ago, I saw some trees get knocked over onto the road across from my house and the cars were trying to drive around them. It was very windy and it was raining sideways when it happened, end quote. Well, the challenge with this report, multiple challenges with this report, are such that it gives no time information, it gives no location data, and it gives very poor event information. This responder says that they saw some trees get knocked over onto the road across from my house. Now, maybe the individual they're talking to knows where that location is, but most people are not going to know, let alone the meteorologist at the National Weather Service. So again, not a good report. It doesn't give any time information because it assumes a few minutes ago, that's assuming that that is accurate in moments of stress or pressure. People's perception of time may not actually align with reality. So all that having been said, not a good report. It needs to give the time, event, and location data clearly and concisely. Here's yet another variation of how this type of event could be badly reported. Quote, earlier this evening around 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 200 hours Universal Time, I was at my home, which is on the corner of Avenue A and B Street. The sky got really dark. There was a strong wind gust that came through and knocked some trees over in my front yard. I've never seen a storm this bad before. In the National Weather Service, I don't understand why they're not doing anything about it yet. End quote. Multiple problems with this report, even though it does give us some of the necessary information we need. It does give us the time. The spotter stated around 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, as a note, in this particular instance, the spotter went to the trouble of also converting local time to universal time. That's not really needed in this scenario. We do have location information that the spotter was at their home on the corner of Avenue A and B Street. So we have the time, we have the location. We don't have the greatest event information, however, because again, we don't know what that strong wind gust was like, and we don't know what the trees were like that got knocked over. Additionally, this report is sensational because it gives the person's relative perception of how bad this storm actually is, and it also violates the principles of professionalism and politeness in particular in reference to the National Weather Service. So our final variation of what a badly reported take on this weather event could sound like would be, quote, earlier this evening around 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 200 hours Universal Time, I was at my house, which is on the corner of Avenue A and B Street. You know the one near the new housing developments, right? Yeah, the one that the local residents weren't very keen on having built. Well, as I was sitting in my living room, I was watching our local news station and my favorite meteorologist was on and they were talking about what this storm could do. I noticed as I looked out my front windows that the sky got really dark. There was a strong wind gust that came through and would you believe it or not, but there were some big trees that got knocked over in my front yard. I've never seen a storm this bad before. I've lived here a long time. The National Weather Service really needs to do something. Hopefully they can take my report and maybe warn some people with it. Now, I did happen to check my weather station after I looked out my front window, and it said that the wind gust was 59 miles per hour, so I do know that we've got a severe measured wind gust. I also know that these trees in my front yard are healthy, mature trees. They're not quite 3 feet wide, so I'd say they're approximately 2 feet in diameter. By the way, I am a train spotter because I took Skywarn training this year. End quote. What's the big challenge with this report? It actually gives us all the information we need. It gives us time, it gives us event, and it gives us location data. But it's far too verbose. All of this could be said in a much more concise fashion that is much more direct and to the point. It is somewhat sensational. And it also just gives us a lot of unnecessary information and opinions that are not relevant to the severe weather event being reported at hand. So, after the series of bad reports on this same weather event, what would a good variation of a report look like, again for this same weather event? Here's what a good report sounds like. Quote, at 9 p.m. local time, I, being a trained spotter, located at Avenue A and B Street, measured a 59-mile-per-hour southerly wind gust that blew down three healthy trees approximately 2 feet in diameter. These trees fell directly on Avenue A and are impeding traffic. End quote. This is an example of an excellent spotter report. We have the time information, 9 p.m. local time. We have the event information. A measured 59-mile-per-hour southerly wind gust blew down three healthy trees approximately 2 feet in diameter over the roadway. We have the location information. We know where the spotter is and we know where the trees got blown down and why they got blown down. And it very concisely states all of this critical information in a short amount of time. Once again, for emphasis, here's this good report again. Quote, at 9 p.m., I, a trained Skywarn spotter located at Avenue A and B Street, measured a 59-mile-per-hour southerly wind gust that blew down three healthy trees approximately 2 feet in diameter. These trees fell directly on Avenue A and are impeding traffic. End quote. That's what we all should strive to achieve when we report time, event, location data in accordance with professionalism, politeness, preparedness, and purposefulness over the air. And this is a work in progress for all of us. I certainly haven't achieved what I would like to achieve when it comes to being a trained communicator, and yet I continue to press onward. It's not, I have not yet achieved perfection, but nevertheless, I am working on moving in that direction over the course of time. So, once again, regardless of the communication method that you are using or that your team is using, Skywarn spotters must seek to hone these communication skills alongside storm spotting skills. We need to take data and translate this into information. We need to take what we observe and communicate it and report it effectively so that it can be understood and that others can take action. And again, just as better weather observation results from, namely study and practice, so does better communication skills. And trained communication skills not only saves time, they also save lives as well. So, to whom do we generally report as Skywarn spotters? Generally, we're going to report to our local agency. We may report to our local 911 dispatch center if there is a weather emergency ongoing. We may report via a communications network over a radio service, otherwise commonly known as a net, which will often be over amateur radio or over GMRS or another radio service as well. Back in the day, CB radio was utilized in West Michigan decades ago for Skywarn nets before amateur radio really became popular. And ultimately, all these reports need to get funneled to the local National Weather Service office in order so that they can be informed and make the right decisions in order to advise or warn the public as needed. So, with all of this understanding in place, let's now talk about specific practices for communicating over three different mediums, namely radio, social media, and phone. So, when it comes to best radio practices, we're going to look at nets, communication networks. We're going to look at pro words, which you may sometimes hear referred to as call tags. Generally speaking, they are known as pro words in both the professional and amateur worlds, and how I will refer to them throughout the remainder of this presentation. Best social media practices, we're going to look at X, otherwise known as Twitter, as well as Facebook. And for phone practices, we're going to talk about reporting directly via phone to your National Weather Service office and in emergency situations to your local 911 dispatch center. So, beginning with best radio practices. Radio networks, or nets, are typically established for Skywarn on ham radio, although GMRS is gaining rapid popularity around the country, and I would highly recommend that people look into this as another tool in the communications toolbox. But regardless, Radio networks or nets establish ad hoc communication networks that usually can continue if power or data loss with other communications infrastructure occurs. If cell towers have intermittent service or a complete failure of service due to severe weather, radio networks that are ad hoc, meaning that people provide their own radios, their own antennas, their own coax, their own power source, those can continue on independent of other infrastructure, such as cellular services and internet. In the United States, there are multiple kinds of radio services that Skywarn spotters would most commonly use. The two biggest would be amateur, otherwise known as ham radio, the General Mobile Radio Service, GMRS. Less commonly used, but still an option out there, although not as ideal, would be Citizens Band or CB, the Multi-Use Radio Service or MURS, and the Family Radio Service or FRS. My personal recommendation is that regardless of what radio service you use, ensure that your team are trained communicators and that you have training standards in place that will exist whether your team is using CB radio or FRS radios or GMRS or ham radio. With radio nets, in order to establish this net, usually a team leader or someone on the team will start this net in advance of or in direct response to a severe weather event, such as a severe thunderstorm or a tornado. And the net control station, the NCS abbreviated, functions as the point person for all reports and other radio traffic. They are truly traffic control for the traffic going over the radio airwaves. If you are a participant in one of these radio nets, you need to always go through the net control when reporting this data, unless given other instructions. So if you want to be a good net participant, as I'm sure we all do, when making a radio transmission, remember this first and foremost, because you'd be surprised how many experienced communicators, even experienced amateur radio operators, still will inadvertently mess this up. And it's something we've all done, but it's something that we really need to try and remember proper protocol here. When making a radio transmission, you always say who you are calling first, who you're going to talk to first, followed by your own identifying information. And this is true whether we're talking public safety radio in the professional world, whether we're talking amateur radio, GMRS, or CB, or whatever the case might be. Always say who you are calling first, followed by your identifier. In the world of amateur radio, to use a famous call sign, if the call sign of net control is W1AW and my personal call sign is KE8RXN, then I could simply call on the air and say W1AW, KE8RXN. The person that I am calling is given first, identified first, W1AW, and then I identify myself last, KE8RXN. And again, it's the exact same protocol for GMRS as well, as it is for ham radio. The only difference is the call signs. For example, my personal GMRS radio call sign is WRPN553. Let's say that Net Control has a GMRS call sign of WABC123. Same protocol that I would utilize on ham radio. WABC123, WRPN553. Again, I am identifying over GMRS who I need to talk to, followed by who I am, who the person is that is talking. Now for CB radio, MERS, and FRS, if you choose to use those are license-free radio services, more prone to interference from the general public. And those, as such, will not have established call signs that you use. In that scenario, I would recommend that you still establish some sort of identifying information, such as simply identifying the net control by the phrase net control and yourself as, you could say, Skywarn Spotter A, or if you're tactically positioned around your county area, you could say Grand River. If you happen to be positioned along the Grand River here in my local county, whatever it is, you still want to identify firstly who you need to talk to. Secondly, identify who you are that is doing the talking. And of course, regardless of what radio service you use, make sure your reports are always in time, event, and location format. If the net control asks you to provide additional information, such as your location information or has other instructions, make sure to always follow those instructions and guidance and answer questions from net control. Now, in some cases, especially if the radio signal is harder to hear, or if you are giving street names that the other person doesn't know how to spell, they may ask you to give it phonetically. And make sure to have these phonetics down by heart. You can drive down the road and read street signs and practice saying the phonetics and so forth. It's really not as difficult as what you might first think it is. You'll find that you can memorize all of these very easily. For example, utilizing standard NATO phonetics, the alphabet is simply Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, India, Juliet, Kilo, Lima, Mike, November, Oscar, Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Sierra, Tango, Uniform, Victor, Whiskey, X-ray, Yankee, and Zulu. So for example, if I need to give my call sign phonetically rather than simply the letters and number KE8RXN, I would instead say Kilo, Echo, 8, Romeo, X-ray, November. Those are using standard phonetics. Also, when participating in a radio network, I recommend that you use the use of pro words. These are short statements, generally 1 to 2 words, that give the reason for why you are pushing the push to talk button on your radio. And this is utilized not only in the amateur world, whether we're talking ham or GMRS, but also in the public safety world as well. For example, let's say that a dispatcher comes over the air and says, Vehicle 7, this is dispatch, status check. Generally, they will talk faster actually than what most amateurs will over the air. What are they saying? Vehicle 7 is who they are trying to talk to. They are identifying themselves as dispatch, and they are asking Vehicle 7 for a status check. Maybe Vehicle 7 is a fire engine vehicle that was dispatched to a structure fire. Dispatch wants to know what the status check is of Vehicle 7. They want to know, for instance, are you on the way to the structure fire? Are you on scene? What's the story? So, quote, Vehicle 7, this is dispatch, status check, end quote. And it's the same thing whether you're utilizing amateur radio or GMRS as well. For example, in amateur radio, if I have information I need to tell the person running the net, I would say, net control, this is KE8RXN info. Again, I, being the Skywarn spotter with the KE8RXN call sign, is calling to net control, and I'm telling net control by simply the phrase info that I have information that they need to hear. Now, the pro words that you utilize will likely vary by team and will be based on your team's individual needs. But here in Kent County, Michigan, these are the pro words that we use and the pro words that we have adopted for 2024. So I would certainly offer them up as a suggestion for you to adopt for your own team or to take certain ones and utilize them for your own needs. Whatever you decide to use for pro words, just make sure that your team is trained on all of them and that they are all clear language, that they are not jargon such as 10 codes like saying 10-4 or something like that, or amateur radio Q codes such as, for example, the phrase QSL, which no one other than the amateur radio operator knows what QSL means. Make sure that your team is trained on their usage and also knows their meaning, and also that their meaning can be clearly understood by others who are not part of your team. So these are the pro words that Kent County Skywarn has adopted for 2024. First, radar. Rather self-explanatory. The spotter has a radar update to provide to net control. On air, this would sound like net control, KE8RXN, radar. Secondly, the pro words, two of them this time, NWS update. This means that the Skywarn spotter has an NWS product update, meaning an area forecast discussion from the local National Weather Service office or another office, an advisory that may have been issued or a warning product that may have been issued, or an update to a hazardous weather outlook. On air, this would sound like via amateur radio, net control, this is KE8RXN, NWS update. It would sound identical if I was using GMRS radio as well. The only difference is the call sign would change. Net control, this is WRPN 553 NWS update. Thirdly, the pro words SPC or Storm Prediction Center update. SPC update. This means that the Skywarn spotter has an SPC convective outlook or a mesoscale discussion update to provide. Net control, this is KE8RXN, SPC update. Net control, this is WRPN 553 SPC update. That is how SPC update would be utilized during a radio net. These ones, weather report and severe weather report, are also rather self-explanatory. The difference being that severe weather report is truly for severe weather conditions that are being reported over the air, whereas weather report is utilized for non-severe conditions. So, for example, let's say I'm on a GMRS Skywarn net, and I would say net control WRPN 553 weather report. Net control knows that I need to reach out to them to give them a weather report, but at the same point in time, that weather report is not severe. If I was on an amateur radio net, I would say, for instance, regarding the relay of severe weather information, net control KE8RXN severe weather report. This means that I have a severe weather report that I need to report to the net control that is either estimated or measured. Additionally, the damage report pro words refer to damage to structures or property. And the National Weather Service needs to know this in order to know what severity of product to issue, but especially your local served agency, especially your county emergency managers and first responders. They need to know the damage reports that are out there so they can start responding to the impacts of severe weather. Net Control WRPN 553 damage report. Net Control KE8RXN damage report. Net control knows that I have a report of damage to either structures or property that needs to urgently be reported to the net control station. This one, the next pro word, is the word emergency. Now, amateur radio operators may think of using the pro word break or break. The reason why we will not use this on Kent County Skywarn, that we will not recommend it, is a twofold reason. The first portion of the answer is that break is often utilized in other types of nets to indicate a paragraph break, and also in the military as well, break would be understood as a paragraph break. In other words, you're starting a new paragraph of thought over the air. Additionally, for those that are more familiar with CB, break sounds a lot like breaker. And as such, we don't recommend the use of break or break when you have emergency information to report. Simply say the word emergency. Net control, KE8RXN emergency. Net control, WRPN 553 emergency. Net control, Team Grand River emergency. Whatever radio service you use, make sure that you utilize emergency when you have immediately impactful life or life-threatening or threats to property that you need to relay to net control. A step down from emergency would be priority. Net control KE8RXN priority. This is where you have important information, but not necessarily life-threatening information to report to net control. A step even further down from priority would be info, where you have just general information that is good for net control to know, but that is not a priority and that is not an emergency. Net control, WRPN 553, info. Now, the purpose for these pro words is so that it not only provides more concise radio transmissions, but it also enables net control to triage incoming radio traffic. For example, if I am a net control station and I have three different reports rapidly come in utilizing the pro words emergency, priority, and info, respectively, which report, which person do I need to talk to first? Obviously, the one who said the word emergency, then followed by the one who said priority, then lastly followed by the one with info. It's very useful for triaging the most important radio traffic first, so that way less important information does not inadvertently tie up the net when there is much more critical information that needs to be communicated at that same time. The next two pro words are contact and relay, respectively. Contact is when a spotter needs to talk directly to another person on the net, but who is not the net control station. For example, this could be how it would sound. Net control, KE8RXN, contact. This means that I am asking net control to contact another person on the team. For example, let's say I say net control, KE8RXN, contact W1AW from KE8RXN. You probably wouldn't phrase it exactly like that so as to avoid confusion with repeating your own call sign, but what it might happen would be something to this effect. Net control, KE8RXN, contact. KE8RXN from net control, go ahead. Net control, this is KE8RXN requesting permission to go directly with W1AW. KE8RXN, this is net control. Permission granted, go ahead. W1AW, KE8RXN. KE8RXN, W1AW, go ahead. And you can hear how that exchange occurred such that I asked the net control station for permission to talk to somebody else. They acknowledged that. They heard who I needed to talk to. I then called directly out to that person, and that person heard me and told me to go ahead with my information for them. But let's say in the middle of that exchange that they couldn't hear me, or they only heard part of my information, but net control heard me, or another radio operator heard the exchange. They could jump in and simply say the word relay. That actually occurred during an HF, or a high frequency net, that occurred for a FEMA Region 5 Oxcom net that I participated in today, where someone a couple times had to jump in and say the word relay because the net control station could not fully copy the person that was talking to them. Relay is when you can hear the person, but another person that they are talking to cannot. So I could simply say relay, or for better etiquette, I could say net control KE8RXN relay. And then generally speaking, net control will let me go ahead and relay the information from person A to the individual that can't hear it. Additional pro words would be, of course, the phrase go or go ahead. I've heard both variations and both are certainly appropriate. That simply indicates that you are acknowledging that you've heard someone and telling them to go ahead with their transmission. The word copy, very self-explanatory, utilized heavily, is that you have heard and you understood the person that is talking to you. If you need them to repeat information, you can simply say again. Or if you need to have them stand by, in other words, to wait for you to talk to them for whatever reason, you can simply say stand by. So for example, let's say net control is triaging multiple reports. Let's say I'll pretend to be two different operators with my own personal call sign, and then I'll, for the purpose of this very quick exercise, adopt the W1AW call sign as well. Let's say that I am calling net control. Net control KE8RXN priority. Net control W1AW info. Net control would then likely say something like this. KE8RXN net control stand by. W1AW net control go ahead. What happened there? Net control utilized several pro words, and he told the first spotter to stand by, and he told the second spotter to go ahead. Now, again, of course, you would want to do that in the order of urgency that those spotters come in. So, for example, if KE8RXN was the one that had the priority traffic and W1AW was the one that had simply general information, you would want to go with KE8RXN first over W1AW. Additional pro words that we utilize on Kent County Skywarn would be affirmative for yes and negative for no. If you are talking on simplex, meaning without a repeater that has beeps or tones that indicate when your transmission or when someone else's transmission is done, generally you would want to throw in the word over. But if you are on a repeater, saying the word over, at least in my opinion, is redundant if there is any kind of repeater beep that indicates when you are done talking. But if you are on a repeater that doesn't have that, or you are talking directly to another person from your radio to their radio, using the word over is certainly encouraged, so they know when you are done talking and ready for them to start talking. Additionally, if you are saying something that doesn't need a response, but you still plan to remain on air, you could simply say the word out. Net control, KE8RXN, out. Now, the variation of that is when you plan to go off air. That is where I recommend, instead of saying the word out, you say the word clear, that you have not only finished talking, but you are no longer monitoring other radio traffic as well. Additionally, asking a station, do you copy, is a phrase you can utilize if you are calling someone and they don't immediately respond, or you're not certain that they heard what you said or understood it. Net control, KE8RXN, do you copy? If net control couldn't hear me very well, he might say KE8RXN net control unreadable, where unreadable is a pro word signifying that they just can't understand what I am saying. And that might be a scenario where a relay station could jump in and say relay. Let's say, however, that we can understand each other and I am in the middle of talking, but they need to disregard what I am saying in that moment because the information has suddenly changed. And the reason for that might be I am giving information about a special weather statement, but as I am talking, and this has happened to me before, a severe thunderstorm warning is issued in the middle of my transmission. This is where the word disregard comes in. Net Control KE8RXN. The National Weather Service in Grand Rapids, Michigan has issued a special weather statement. Disregard. The National Weather Service in Grand Rapids, Michigan has issued a severe thunderstorm warning for, and then I would give the criteria. That's where the term disregard would be utilized. So those are best radio practices in terms of net procedures, in terms of proper identification and the order of identification, and also the pro words that we have adopted and that I recommend that you utilize for your teams, or at least use them as a springboard for developing your own pro words. So let's now briefly touch on best social media practices. Social media is extremely useful for rapid dissemination of pictures, of videos, and text reports, and it's extremely useful because you can attach more information than simply audio, like over radio. Now, of course, if you're using digital radio modes, you can sometimes send text messages and pictures, sometimes even streaming video over radio, especially if you're using a professional radio network. But not all Skywarn teams necessarily utilize that. In Kent County, Skywarn, we currently don't utilize digital amateur radio for that purpose right now, but there's nothing saying that we won't down the road. But nevertheless, social media is very useful for disseminating pictures and videos of weather. Now, it's not a guarantee that local agencies or the local National Weather Service will promptly see it. They still want those reports regardless, just don't use it as the only communications option for urgent or, in some cases, emergent weather reports. And just like best radio practices, social media practices also need to follow the same four principles of good communication: professionalism, politeness, preparedness, and purpose. Now, practically speaking, I would encourage Skywarn spotters to follow and become familiar with the local National Weather Service office, preferably on X, otherwise known as Twitter, and Facebook. Those are where the National Weather Service offices will officially post, and what they post on the internet with their official feeds can be taken as accurate information from that office. Make sure that when you are giving reports on Twitter or Facebook, that you give it just as you would over the air in time, event, location format, following our four communication principles. And also make sure if you can safely do so, don't run out in the middle of a tornado to try to get a video of it for TikTok. But if you can safely do so, try and include pictures and videos as well. That's really helpful for the National Weather Service office to have that visual confirmation. Also, as a recommendation, do not send them, please, radar screenshots. Now, becoming a trained radar observer and analyst is wonderful. Radar is definitely part of the intelligence gathering for Skywarn teams. It's very critical and very useful for good team functions, but you don't need to send pictures of radar to the National Weather Service. This happens quite a lot during severe weather events, unfortunately, where people will, out of their enthusiasm, take screenshots out of their radar program that they like and tag their local National Weather Service office. The NWS doesn't need your radar screenshots simply because they are trained professionals in observing radar. So certainly don't want to discourage anyone from learning more and studying radar. It's critical, it's wonderful, but we don't need to provide the National Weather Service with that information. They're already on top of that for us. And of course, it almost goes without saying, but nevertheless, don't engage in speculation about tornado damage ratings, about online drama, or criticize the national, criticize NOAA or the SPC or the WPC or your National Weather Service office. Let the professionals be professional and follow the four communications principles we've talked about, not only on air, but also in social media as well. And just remember that what you post on the internet will very likely be there for all of time and eternity for anybody and everybody to see for as long as the internet may last. And finally, wrapping up with a quick discussion on best phone practices. Again, as I stated previously in the talk, The NWS will often give out direct phone numbers that spotters can call when reporting in time, event, location format. And this is reporting information for them. It's not to ask them for forecast guidance or ask them for information. Now, if you happen to do that, they may be gracious with you and give you that information, certainly. But again, the spotter number is for the purpose of you reporting information to them. They're very busy, and it's not a number for you to simply call and have a chat with them. And also answer honestly. If you aren't sure about what you're reporting, make sure to say so, and then they might be able to fact check you from other reports they've received or what they are seeing from radar, or in some cases, what they are observing directly themselves. Now, a comment that if you observe an emergency, it's definitely recommended, if at all possible, to actually call your 911 dispatch center first. And this is because your local dispatch can usually patch you or patch themselves directly to the National Weather Service office. And this ensures that both public safety and the NWS together know when a weather emergency is taking place. Now, if you can't use 911, still try and get through to the NWS, but chances are if you can't use 911, you probably can't use any cell service at that time. So do the best you can, call it into your radio network and say the word emergency to try and get that information to someone as quickly as possible. At the end of the day, however, a phone call will be the most direct and the most certain way to inform the NWS of your information. And just remember that cell phone service and internet is wonderful. It's great. It's more and more reliable over the years and fails less and less. For example, in major hurricanes now, generally speaking, internet and cell either stay up or they come back relatively quickly, much more rapidly than in, say, even 15 years ago. But nevertheless, you would still be surprised at how often those communication networks and infrastructure can fail. So make sure that you always have a backup communications plan. Make sure that you not only become a trained Skywarn spotter, but regardless of what you use, whether it's a radio service such as amateur radio or GMRS, a smartphone application such as Zello, social media such as Facebook, or simply a good old phone call, make sure that you are professional, that you are polite, that you are prepared, that you know your purpose, and that you give everything in time, event, and location format. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you in future videos on my channel.